So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Kevin Gover, our first panelist.
Thank you, Lauren. I just want to do a couple of things and then let the rest of the panel take over. At the NMAI, I wanted to provide some of our repatriation statistics. Obviously, it's long been a priority of the NMAI, given that the first repatriation law would be in our actual authorizing legislation. And our Board of Trustees and our repatriation staff have been very aggressive throughout the history of the NMAI in seeing that these things are returned. One key element of our policy that has so far gone unmentioned is that the NMAI does not wish to have any human remains in our collections, regardless of how they were acquired, regardless of any of the circumstances. And so the board very promptly deaccessioned all human remains in the collections. That doesn't mean they were disposed of. It simply means they are not a part of the NMAI collections, although a good many of them are still held by us, mostly because we don't always know to whom they should be returned. And so one of the major projects at the NMAI is to determine the origins of as many of these as possible, see that they are returned, or failing that, ultimately, we will find another disposition. And several Indian nations have offered their good offices to assist us in that and provide a final resting place for these remains. Since 1991, the NMAI has returned 549 human remains, nearly 30,000 funerary objects, another 1,045 sacred objects, 19 objects of cultural patrimony, 304 items that were both sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony, and 31 items that we determined were unethically acquired. We still have a fair number of pending repatriation claims, 16, but that covers multiple objects in virtually every case, and so we'll continue to diligently work through those. A couple of things I wanted to mention about the history of repatriation both at the Smithsonian and at the NMAI. A few years ago, there was a review by the General Accountability Office of the repatriation program at the Smithsonian. And as is occasionally the case, the report seemed to be a solution in search of a problem, because after reviewing the work that the Smithsonian has done in this connection, they found very little to criticize. Nevertheless, they did have solutions to these non-existent problems that they were anxious to share with us. There were a couple, though, that we did think were quite meritorious, one of which is that we would begin providing Congress an annual report on the repatriation activities of the Smithsonian. Interestingly enough, we were 20 years into the program before there was any real inquiry into how's it going, which could be interpreted as a sign of neglect, but it could also be interpreted as a sign that things were going pretty well. And I do think that was the case. The repatriation record of the Smithsonian is very strong, and while there will always be objections, and there have been, to certain decisions, the fact is that the overwhelming majority of repatriation claims are settled amicably between the Smithsonian and the tribe or Native Hawaiian group that is petitioned for repatriation, and really has become quite a collaborative process between the institution and the Indian tribes from where these materials originate. I just wanted to mention one other thing. I was inspired by Rick's speech this morning, and I've often had some of those thoughts, perhaps not quite so eloquently expressed. But one of the great things about being a museum director is you get to travel around the country going to museums, and you get to call that work. And I've had the occasion just in this past few months actually, to be at both the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City and at the Field Museum in Chicago. And these two institutions came together in a very appropriate way. The Nelson Atkins has mounted an exhibition along with the Quai Branly Museum in Paris to create an exhibition of Plains Indian art. And in the catalog for, it's called The Plains Indians Artist of Earth and Sky. And in the catalog that was produced by the Nelson Atkins, there's an interesting story told by the curator, Gaylord Torrance, where he had inquired of the Field Museum about the availability of a Pawnee star chart that had been part of a sacred bundle that had found its way into the collections of the Field Museum. The response of the curator at the Field to the curator from the Nelson Atkins was interesting, and I wanted to read it to you because it really makes the point that Rick was making, which is that the way museums work with this material, in part because of the repatriation requirement itself, has changed quite dramatically. And so Gaylord reports an email from Jonathan Haas, who was the former curator of North American ethnography at the Field Museum. And Mr. Haas said, "During our discussions with the Pawnee, we agreed to rewrap the various bundles. One of the tribal leaders came to the museum and showed me how to properly rebundle the material, including an appropriate state of mind. Over the next several weeks, I rewrapped all the sacred bundles, including the big black meteorite bundle that contains the star chart. It was one of the most difficult things I have ever had to do as a curator. At the time, it was agreed that the bundles would never again be unwrapped unless they were repatriated to the Pawnee, and they took responsibility for them forever after. The bundles are all extremely powerful and dangerous to those who handle them. In addition to all the cultural and sacred issues, the star chart and associated bundle could not be unwrapped without causing significant physical damage to the bundle as a whole. In rewrapping them, concern was given to their cultural care, not to their conservation. There is basically nothing that could justify unwrapping them for an exhibit or anything else." Dr. Haas went on to say, and this is the most striking part of what he said, "A number of people, including some here at the Field Museum, have asked why we keep the bundles if they cannot be displayed or researched. My response is that the 21st century is bringing us new kinds of curation, and taking care of objects for Native peoples is one of those new curatorial roles." That, I believe, really is the influence of the National Museum of the American Act and of the repatriation laws, that the care of these items is no longer about their permanent preservation as part of the national heritage, but rather that they should be cared for in collaboration and according to the instructions of indigenous communities in the United States and elsewhere. What NAGPRA has really done, what the NMAI Act and NAGPRA has really done, far from leading to the purging of these incredible collections that do exist in many places in the United States. Rather than leading to the purging of the collections, it has led us to a new collaborative care for these collections, where Native communities really have, as Rick suggested, the authority to require that these things be handled in the manner that they describe. So it has been, in some respects, a very quiet but an extraordinarily important revolution in how museums understand their responsibilities for Native American collections. and that is very much to the credit of the people who worked for, the people who introduced, and the people who voted for the National Museum of the American Indian Act and NAGPRA. So with that, I'll pass it on to Brenda.
May I ask you a couple of questions?
Sure, sure.
So I think that, you know, that obviously traditional care is one of the, shall we say, unanticipated but very beneficial outcomes of this legislation and the increased collaboration. Can you think of some other sort of what maybe indirect benefits, the things that are not necessarily prescribed by the law but have come about as a result of the law?
Well, sure. I've not, you know, the collaboration between museums and Native communities is not limited to conservation care, but rather pertains to the whole of the representation and research of museums about Native Americans, past and present. And so the change in that relationship between the Indians and the museums is really quite thoroughgoing and goes beyond the collections and all the way to the research, the publications, certainly the exhibitions that museums do about Indians.
So I recently read an article that said that repatriation has resulted in, and I'll quote, a wider distribution of information regarding museum collections, a richer understanding of cultural diversity across diverse institutions, a closer relationship among all affected parties, and a reduction in trafficking of cultural material. Do you agree with that?
I do. I know probably the least about that last assertion concerning the trafficking of the materials, but my anecdotal experiences are that collectors are extremely careful in the transfer of these materials, at least here in the United States, less so obviously in Europe. You know, one of the important elements, it's not just about the transfer of authority to tribes to control how these materials are worked with, but the perhaps an unanticipated benefit is that the museums are learning more about their own collections because of this new relationship. And so when we host a tribal delegation at the NMAI to look at the collections for repatriation purposes, the real benefit is to us because aside from repatriation, we learn a great deal about the other objects in the collections from the communities themselves. And so they end up teaching us about what is in the collection. And that's to the good, obviously, of the museum.
And I guess my last question is to look into the future and ask you what you think will be left to be done 25 years from now on repatriation, or do you think it will all be resolved by then?
I think we heard something earlier today about how it's never over. I think certainly the pace will slow in terms of the items that are being returned, the number of requests that are being received. Let's acknowledge that there are some holdout institutions out there that probably are not making the effort that they should to return the items that are subject to repatriation. But on the whole, I think the major controversy around repatriation and this relationship between the tribes and the museums will be, again, what Rick was describing earlier when he quoted Elaine Gurian, saying that I predict we will not be able to recreate what all the fuss was about. I think that's right, and that 25 years from now, when there are a whole new generation of curators and museum professionals that are working with this material, they might well laugh a little at the the agony that the museums went through in making these decisions and that we found so difficult, I think that those decisions will be stunningly easy in future generations.
Right.